Those of you that have never organized an event will not know the fear of pending rain when you've got a big one. Not knowing how many people will show and will the rain hold off, but today, the day of Ganesh Chaturthi, I offered a peanut to Ganesh when I got in the office, and it appears that the elephant god smiled down on me. So thanks everybody for coming out today for this review of the 2+2 dialogue and what's ahead in U.S.-India affairs. My name is Rick Rosso. I hold the Wadhwani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies here at CSIS. For those of you that are familiar with coming to CSIS events, I am also today your designated safety officer. We get a 5% reduction in insurance for making this announcement, so enjoy. If there is some kind of an emergency, which we don't expect, follow me as you run crying and screaming and everything else. Back around the corner down 17th Street to the National Geographic Museum, and Dr. Hamry promises he will buy everybody ice cream. You said that so many times. I hope one day, not for an emergency, we get to take him up on it. But it is terrific to see so many folks out here to have a conversation about the state of U.S.-India affairs, especially after such a significant event. I was going to make some kind of iPhone announcement joke, but the crowd behind this said that it was a terrible joke, so I took that one off. But another thing that's kind of competing with everybody's attention today is the things happening on the West Coast, but this is a lot more exciting for those of us in the policy wonk space. I think we celebrated, or not celebrated, but we look back at 20 years since India tested nuclear weapons earlier this summer at an event. And that initiated really the first high-level sustained dialogue between the two countries. Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh, who was a key advisor to Prime Minister Vajpayee and later became foreign minister. That group met 14 times across 3 years. And followed up not long after with the launch of the commercial dialogue. Ray and Don and I were there in 2000 when President Clinton visited India, and they announced the commercial dialogue, the economic dialogue, the strategic and commercial dialogue more recently. Now we've evolved to a 2+2 dialogue. And I think to me and to a lot of others in the strategic community, it's a welcome shift. We've seen over the years state and Department of Defense at different times kind of leading the main work on deepening our strategic relationship, thinking of State Department going back a little over 10 years, really kind of putting a lot of the work in to secure the civilian nuclear agreement. Department of Defense more recently with such cool initiatives as the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, creation of the India Rapid Reaction Cell, and I know Duncan's here representing the Rapid Reaction Cell. So you've seen these two agencies at different times really kind of taking the lead in deepening our strategic relationship, and to have a dialogue that bridges that makes a lot of sense, and as we see now, can really result in some tremendous deliverables that our two terrific speakers will bring out. There are a lot of opportunities and challenges across the Indo-Pacific that really need the combined efforts of our diplomatic and military communities, defense communities. Also, one last point, I'll just say that what you hear a lot in the U.S.-India policy space is the inability for Indian governments to take big steps just before elections. And you've got some big state elections coming up later this year. You've got a national election that is now less than a year away. And I think this is further proof with this joint statement and the visit that is false as false can be. You saw the Singh government risk his government less than a year before the 2009 election as he submitted the Safeguards Agreement to the International Atomic Energy Agency. These kind of agreements that tangibly move our defense relationship forward. But just because elections are coming up doesn't mean we get agreements. You need terrific representatives, terrific diplomats to get that done, and we've got two here on stage today. So we'll start with Ambassador Alice Wells, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia at the Department of State. A long, distinguished diplomatic career, Ambassador to Jordan, postings within the Bureau with Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Bill Burns when he was Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and also served in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Also postings in Islamabad and Riyadh, and Special Assistant to the President on Russia and Central Asia from 2012 to 2013. To her right is David Helvey, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs at the Department of Defense. David, deep experience, as everybody in this room knows, on East Asian security issues, having multiple roles in that region, including as country director for China before moving over and taking over the current role that he sits in. Also spent time with half a step outside as the Distinguished Research Fellow in the Center for Study of Chinese Military Affairs at National Defense University. So thanks to both of you for joining. And Alice, if you want to go ahead and lead off.
Sure, it's terrific to be here. Thank you for organizing. I think the 2+2's significance was that it really reaffirmed the strength of the U.S.-India relationship. It reaffirmed the alignment of our interests and our values in promoting an open and free Indo-Pacific. It also underscored our interest in amplifying what it means to have a major defense partner in India, and really provided the building blocks, not for the next 6 months or year, but for decades of how we move forward carefully in building what is this very special relationship. The 2+2 was first announced by President Trump after Prime Minister Modi's June visit last year. It was announced in August, and it was designed to increase principal level engagement on our core diplomatic and security priorities. And it really served to acknowledge, it was certainly our acknowledgement of India's emergence as a global power and our commitment to support India as a net security provider in the region. We don't do a lot of 2+2s. This is actually Secretary Pompeo's first overseas 2+2. It was first trip to India in his current capacity. It was a big deal. And I think the warmth of the trip, of the visit, was obvious. We saw Foreign Minister Swaraj greet the secretary at the plane. And it was, there were some rumors, I know, in the press about the delay in holding the 2+2, which was first occasioned by Secretary Tillerson's departure and then by DPRK diplomacy. But I think that was all misplaced. And I certainly think the joint statement and the substance of the joint statement and the atmospherics, underscored just how much effort both of our administrations have been making to ensure its success. Really, the level of engagement by the secretaries was unprecedented. They spent the better part of the day discussing Indo-Pacific cooperation and defense and security partnerships with their counterparts. The 2+2 sessions were then followed by meetings with the Prime Minister and with the National Security Advisor. And I think both of our bosses really view the 2+2 as the primary platform to set the course for our diplomatic and defense cooperation. We're planning to meet annually in this format, and we've additionally agreed to set up secure communication lines between Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis and their Indian counterparts. Obviously, the centerpiece achievements included granting India the Strategic Trade Authorization Tier 1 status and finalizing the COMCASA, the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, which I'm going to let David describe, as well as describe the broader defense security context of the 2+2 sessions. But really, the discussions also focused on just that convergence that we saw in the complementary speeches by President Trump at Da Nang and Prime Minister Modi at Shangri-La. So first, a key subject area was the Indo-Pacific, and I think you're right. The Indo-Pacific Command is a big symbol of the strategic vision we're bringing to this region. I think between the United States and India, you see an agreement on the principles. As democracies that are bookending the region, we go from the west coast of the United States to the west coast of India. We agreed on the need to collaborate more closely to ensure the future of the Indo-Pacific, that it's based on peace, stability, growing prosperity, that it's anchored in a rules-based orders. And the discussions really focused on how do we work together to promote economic growth, governance, and security. The trip happened immediately after Secretary Pompeo's announcements at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum here at ASEAN that launched $300 million in additional FMF, as well as over $100 million in programs that would support infrastructure development, energy, cyber. So there was a lot of substance going into this session. We also had an opportunity in talking about our own Bay of Bengal initiative, increasing the maritime capacity of countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, where India has an obvious interest, and India too is working to create a fusion center. So there was a lot of overlap there in the principles that we bring to looking at the region. But there's also an agreement on approach. We're both focused on ASEAN's criticality. ASEAN is the centerpiece of Indo-Pacific architecture, but at the same time, we're working to deepen our trilateral and our quadrilateral cooperation with Japan and Australia. And we're also taking steps to broaden the level of cooperation at the embassy level. So at the very sort of grassroots level of diplomacy, we can work with our partners to identify areas where we can come together with resources and with diplomacy to make a difference and to provide options. And we will be holding a trilateral at the UN General Assembly between at the Deputy Secretary level. I think the second major area of conversation was Afghanistan. We certainly, under the South Asia strategy, welcome India's enhanced role in Afghanistan. The fact that it has pledged $3 billion through 2020 on economic and development assistance. We, I think, endorsed the trilateral framework that we have with India and Afghanistan. We both are absolutely committed to an Afghan-owned, led, and controlled peace process and are working transparently and closely together. And we share a common view on the need to defeat ISIS. And really, I think we both believe that there's been a lot of damage caused by those countries who use ISIS as a pretext to support the Taliban. In this context of Afghanistan, we did hear India's concerns or interest in sustaining Chabahar Port, the role that Chabahar could potentially play in north-south connectivity and providing an alternative ingress to Afghanistan, in particular for the wheat shipments that India has been providing, and just serving as an alternative transit route. And this is something that is under consideration by the administration, and so we took on board India's concerns. There were also, I think, very important conversations on counterterrorism, which has been always a very important part of our relationship with India. We've been coordinating on terrorist designations. We have a thriving counterterrorism dialogue. We have ongoing efforts by the U.S. administration to sanction a range of global terrorists, including nearly a dozen Lashkar-e-Taiba targets and aliases over the last year. And certainly with the 10th anniversary of the Mumbai attack approaching, we share a concern over the continued ability of terrorist proxies to operate on Pakistani soil. And so as the Secretary said publicly, I mean, the U.S. is really looking for actions, not words, from the government of Pakistan, and obviously this is a shared concern. Additional topics of conversation included Iran and DPRK. We emphasized the need to continue to maintain pressure on the DPRK. On Iran, we emphasized the administration's commitment to reimposing sanctions in order to halt malign Iranian behavior, and the expectation that our partners will work to reduce oil imports to zero. I think there was some concern I heard from the business community over the last several months that the 2+2 might mean that we were going to slight the trade and economic issues. And I want to assure everyone that's not the case, that it does not de-emphasize the importance of economic and commercial aspects of the relationship. There were very frank and candid conversations. We both recognize that much work needs to be done in this area of the partnership. We've expanded bilateral trade by $12 billion over the last year, bringing it to a total of about $126 billion. Two-way investment has reached an estimated $58 billion. But USTR is in an intensive dialogue with the government of India on trade and investment issues. These conversations are continuing. They'll feed into a trade policy forum at the end of October. And I think what I took away from the conversation was a real commitment from both sides to break down barriers. I think we all recognize that energy, defense, and aviation, commercial aviation, are really crucial sectors where we can boost trade and reduce deficits. The United States remains India's best trade partner. We're India's top market for exports. And so, again, the commitment is there. And the specific instance that we did focus on, both in the joint statement and in our conversation, was on Westinghouse. And for someone like me who worked for Bill Burns many years ago when the Civ nuke discussions were underway and the 1-2-3 agreement was being negotiated, we're approaching the 10th anniversary with Westinghouse coming out of bankruptcy. We now have an opportunity to cross the finish line, to really culminate what was this historic process that began a decade ago, to be able to have one of our premier companies provide some of the safest and cleanest fuel that will benefit tens of millions of Indian citizens. And so it's a really, I think, another exciting chapter that hopefully we can close. And certainly we will be supporting Westinghouse as it continues its conversations with India. So it's up to the United States to host the next 2+2 next year, but we're going to have a lot of work in between now and then. And for those of you who've done the India count, there isn't a month when we don't have a cabinet official in Delhi or a high-level delegation. That pace is going to continue. I'll stop there and turn it over to David.
Great, thanks. David? Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thanks for everybody that's here. Thanks for your interest in the U.S.-India relationship, where it is today and where it can be going out into the future. And right at the top, I'd just like to say that I would echo 100% the comments that Ambassador Wells made about the recent 2+2 meeting and about the overall trajectory of the U.S.-India relationship. It's always a safe place to be following Alice when she talks, because from a defense perspective, I just agree 100%. Within the building and from Secretary Mattis's perspective, we're supremely pleased with the outcomes of the 2+2 ministerial. The Secretary's described this most recent meeting as successful and highly productive, which is important. I mean, it shows that there was deliberate and concrete outcomes from these talks, and I'll be able to go into them in a little bit more detail here in a moment. But I think the biggest thing that's come out of this 2+2 is we put the U.S.-India relationship and the defense relationship in particular on a higher trajectory, and that comes from consistent and sustained high-level engagement and a lot of the work done by the staffs on both sides to be able to tee up the issues for decision and action by the senior leadership of both sides. Within the Department of Defense, we put a priority on the U.S.-India relationship and on India as a partner. And from our perspective, this is really a natural partnership between the United States and India. We've got two of the world's largest democracies. We've got a real strategic convergence, or a convergence of our strategic interests. And I think that's something that certainly was interwoven throughout the discussions, both between Secretary Mattis and Minister Sitharaman and Secretary Pompeo and Minister Swaraj. As Alice mentioned, this is a relationship that's founded on shared values and a respect for the rules-based international order, which is something that really brings us together, and it animates a lot of the cooperation that we have, not only bilaterally, but with other partners throughout and across the Indo-Pacific region. And lastly, there is clearly a shared commitment at the very top of both countries to have and move out on a forward-looking strategic partnership. And I think if you take a look at the joint statement coming out of the 2+2, that's something that is there throughout every single paragraph about having a forward-looking strategic partnership. I'll spend a little bit of time on the defense relationship and defense cooperation, which is very much a driver of this relationship, although I would point out that, as Secretary Mattis has said, the defense relationship, even as we're advancing, all this is occurring within the context and the four corners of the diplomatic and the political relationship that's being set and managed by the State Department and their counterparts on the Indian side. So we've been able to make a lot of progress, but this is all done within the context of the overall U.S.-India relationship. And I'd also add that the progress that we've been able to make in recent months and recent years is due in large part by the fact that we're standing on the shoulders of others that have worked with the strategic vision, the foresight, and patience in years past to put us in a position where we've been able to receive and realize the outcomes that we have today and will continue to realize in the months and years ahead. So we made a couple of noteworthy outcomes that I think certainly laid the groundwork for a great deal of future cooperation between the United States and India. Alice mentioned the Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, or COMCASA agreement, as being one of the biggest outcomes. Both Secretary Mattis and Minister Sitharaman signed the COMCASA agreement at the conclusion of the 2+2. And what this agreement will allow us to do is deepen the interoperability between the United States military and the Indian Armed Forces and enable India to have greater access to U.S. systems, but also optimize India's ability to use the systems that it has, the U.S. origin equipment that it has. So this was a major accomplishment. We certainly look forward to maintaining the momentum in concluding soon the other two remaining enabling agreements that we have outstanding with our Indian partners. We also committed both sides to expanding the major defense partnership designation that we've had in place since 2016 to be able to build on this status or this designation to move beyond a focus on defense trade and technology, which is not to say that we're diminishing it in any way, but to build from that to look at areas where we can cooperate and coordinate at a strategic level across the region to really kind of bring some greater substance and concrete actions that we can cooperate. And I think that's an important contribution, and it certainly reflects how both sides apprise and estimate not only the current status but the potential of the U.S.-India relationship. The two sides also agreed to a new tri-service exercise, which is a tangible sign of the increasing military-to-military cooperation that we have at all levels of our military institutions on both sides. And this will give us an opportunity to build on some of the work that we've done in the past in terms of maritime security and maritime domain kind of cooperation. And this will give us a platform to be able to do that, building on, I think, the history of cooperation that we have through the Malabar exercise series. But this is going to give us another platform and another outlet to be able to build. And then finally, but certainly not least, in recognition of India's vibrant innovation ecosystem, whether it's in Bangalore or Hyderabad, we're looking at ways to explore cooperation in the defense innovation space, and we're able to conclude before the 2+2 a new memorandum of intent between the Defense Innovation Unit on the U.S. side and the Indian Defense Innovation Organization to look at ways that the two institutions, organizations can cooperate in the defense innovation space, which I think again highlights the promise and potential of where the two sides can work together in our shared interests. So I'll just conclude by noting that we certainly value the continued collaboration that we have with India as, in Secretary Mattis's words, a co-equal democracy, and look forward to deepening the cooperation as two strategic partners as we work together to realize a safe, secure, and free Indo-Pacific region, or as Prime Minister Modi has said, a place where nations small and large can prosper, free and fearless in their choices. So,
great.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to you both. And I mean, I absolutely agree with the way that you've surmised. Having a summit where this many substantive agreements get signed, it is fairly unusual. And doing so, again, ahead of elections and such is not always the easiest. So terrific work from both of you and your departments in seeing that through. Alice, if I can start, I think when a lot of us outside the Track 1 get together and we kind of review the bidding on the good and the bad that's happening in the relationship, the two things that hang over our heads are potential sanctions, Iran and Russia. You mentioned briefly on Iran, but I wonder if you can explore that a bit more deeply. I mean, do you think India is willing to draw down? Is it going to be a mix about drawing down oil as they did in the past and progress in other areas, or does it feel like it's a pretty hard stop in terms of what they're doing on oil buys? And I do appreciate your comments on Chabahar as well, because clearly, the upside on what they're doing there is in our interest. But is there any more light you can shed in terms of where we draw the line on what they're doing with Iran in terms of oil purchases?
Right. I mean, the administration is very focused on bringing Iranian oil exports down to zero by November. And so we've had detailed conversations, both with the Indian private sector and our Indian counterparts, to discuss what this means, what steps the United States is taking to ensure that there will be adequate supply, because obviously India, as are other countries, are quite sensitive to price fluctuations. Again, particularly in an election year, this is a very salient issue. And so I think we've already seen a reduction underway over the last month. There's been a substantial reduction. I think the private sector responds to risk and concern over consequences. So I think that's going to be, you're going to see a clear response from the private sector in that regard. And we'll continue our conversations with the government of India. Yeah.
And maybe both of you can touch on the status of CAATSA sanctions. I mean, I think a lot of people breathe a sigh of relief, which may have been overdone a bit with the NDAA legislation sort of expanding a little bit, the ability to give waivers on this. Some talks ahead of time, I think, that we would begin discussions with India once again on missile defense and alternatives and such. But what is the status? Should we be concerned? Is there under the NDAA rule there, do we feel there's enough space, or is that unclear? I mean, how should we be viewing this on the outside in terms of potential CAATSA related sanctions?
If I could answer this first and see if Alice has anything to add. I mean, I think I think the first point is that the administration is absolutely committed to implementing, all of the CATSA provisions. I mean, that's implementing fully all the CATSA provisions. And we are working with our partners, including India, and talking to them about ways to encourage them to avoid potentially sanctionable, acquisitions or activities. And so those conversations are ongoing. I can't really get into details or the specifics of what those conversations are, but we are having those conversations, and I think that's an important part of the discussion in the process. With respect to the waiver provision, as you point out, there was a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act. This was something that my boss, Secretary Mattis, in partnership with Secretary Pompeo, had worked really hard to receive in the legislation. There was also a lot of support from members of Congress, the India caucus, to do that. And fundamentally, though, this is a provision that allows the president to make these determinations. And I mean, I'm not going to get ahead of the president on how he may or may not, exercise that authority. But I do think, it's just important to know that the purpose of the sanctions is not to punish our allies or our partners or damage their military capabilities. It's to impose costs and consequences on Russia for its malign behavior. But this is a complicated issue. We're having the conversations with India and all our partners, but I'm not going to speculate on how, when, or where, or if that waiver provision would be employed.
Yeah. Well, looking back at the most recent 10-year defense framework agreement that we signed a few years back, we did, in that version, which was not in previous, talk about common platforms, and whether we want to say that's code for interoperability or whatever. Apart from the S-400 missile system, India still buys heavily from Russia. As we think about sharing advanced technologies, how big of a concern overall does India's continued defense relationship with Iran weigh? Is it not such a big consideration anymore? We're comfortable sharing because they've got the controls in place. Is it still a consideration even ahead of this, single system that we've been talking about so much?
Well, I don't want to, kind of get ahead of, Indian decision making. So I mean, it's hard to talk hypotheticals. But look, we recognize that there's, considerable amount of India's legacy force structures, Russian origin or sourced to other defense partners of India, and I think part of the process of working with the Indians is to make sure that we've got the right assurances and mechanisms in place to ensure that our defense technology, which is hard to come by and based on investment of considerable resources to develop the type of technology that we have, that we want to put in the field with our forces, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, to make sure that they have the best equipment. We're willing to share that with our partners, and we just have to make sure that we have the right types of assurances with that. And so when you have agreements, whether it's CAMCASA or others, that allow us to have that confidence, that gives us the space to be able to move forward and look at where we can do, co-development or co-production, which is something that we're looking at in the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, or even just looking at ways to have the right type of interoperability, and that's what the CAMCASA agreement allows. So this is something that's very carefully done, carefully managed, but something that we do with all of our partners. So. It's just part of how we work with allies, militaries, partners, anybody that has our equipment. So,
well, let's look at the Indo-Pacific. I remember, before Secretary Tillerson came to CSIS to give that speech that really, I think, electrified a lot of us in the U.S.-India lane, and reviewing it and seeing, the depth of content there and this kind of vision, which didn't coin the term necessarily, but how quickly it's become the jargon we all use. I mean, in one day, it went from, kind of a niche fringe term that's used once in a while to really becoming in the lexicon. I think from my conversations with Indian strategic analysts, policymakers, the concern that was voiced pretty early on was the geographical limitations on Indo-Pacific, meaning that, we would say that it ends at India's west coast, but in practice, there wasn't even that much Eastern Indian Ocean content in there necessarily. In this joint statement, you begin to see that. before the joint statement, the announcement, I don't know if it's been made public, but the press in India is reporting on India being able to have somebody posted at Central Command. In the joint statement, Indian Navy engaging with CENTCOM Navy. I mean, it looks like we've kind of broadened the aperture. Is that something that in the Track 1 discussions, India made a pretty strong point in? Or is it something that's kind of matured as we begun to view our own partnership across the region there? Was it a big point they brought up on kind of expanding the geographical definition to make sure that it covers some of the challenges that India thinks in the Indian Ocean wouldn't be covered in India's west coast and beyond, or is it sort of a natural progression, would you say?
I mean, I think, when I talked at the top about how this is a natural partnership based on a convergence of strategic interests, we have a pretty fulsome discussion with our Indian counterparts about their security concerns and our security concerns, in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. So I wouldn't say that an arbitrary line that either defines a COCOM's combatant command's area of responsibility, or the term that we've used to describe the limits of a quote Indo-Pacific strategy inhibits in any way the ability of the United States and India to be able to discuss, cooperate, and identify where we have either common concern or find opportunities. One of the things that our office does, and I know this is a bit of a diversion, we write and publish an annual report to Congress on military and security developments to the People's Republic of China, where this year we talked quite extensively in the report about China's roles, behavior, and activities, not only in the Western Pacific, but in the Indian Ocean and beyond. So I think so when we talk about where the United States and India can have conversations, it's not bound by a line in the middle of the Indian Ocean at all. And the fact that we've got discussions about cooperation between the Indian Navy and the U.S. Navy Central Command, or NAVCENT, I think again also underscores that. We've got India is in the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility, but we're talking about ways to establish links between the Indian Navy and the United States Central Command. So I think that's something where there's no boundary or no seam to how the United States and India can conceive of items for discussion or areas of potential cooperation.
Yeah.
And I would note, I mean, both Japan and India have different definitions than we do of the Indo-Pacific, and so they do go to the east coast of Africa, but that doesn't mean we can't talk about our cooperation off the east coast of Africa as well. And in fact, the U.S. and India already have successful partnerships, whether it's in peacekeeping training or in some development work, working together in Africa. And so I agree with David, we're not limited by Indo-Pacific as well, where we continue our cooperation.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Alice, two agreements, two global agreements were highlighted in the joint statement. The UN Convention on Terrorism, International Terrorism, and also Nuclear Suppliers Group. One, the Terrorism Convention, which typically had not been mentioned for a number of years in U.S. joint statements, and suddenly is starting to be a bit more prominent. Nuclear Suppliers Group, which has been on the table for some time, but difficult to give momentum. Can you give us an update on the Convention on Terrorism and Nuclear Suppliers Group? What might we expect moving forward here? Is there progress on either of those two issues? Is it what is there to look forward to, do you think, in the next year?
Well, I think this is aspirational. I mean, and the fact that the U.S. and India have such close cooperation on counterterrorism, we're both affirming our support for the UN's role and the purpose of the resolution. On a nuclear supplier group, obviously it's a consensus-based organization. India has not been able to secure membership as a result of opposition from China. We have deemed that we're not going to limit our own cooperation with India based on a Chinese veto. So of course we've moved ahead with the STA1 authorization, and we certainly believe that India well meets all of the qualifications of the nuclear supplier group, and will continue to actively advocate on behalf of India's membership.
And a bit of a lighter side for those of you that haven't reviewed the STA1 annex and the materials that are covered. I mean, you've got hardcore materials related to advanced aeronautics and carbon fiber. And there's a whole section too of strange diseases that I'd never heard about in my lifetime, donkey pox and things like this. So new things to give you nightmares if one of these things escapes. But the annex really has some important material and content in there that I don't think people have bothered to go through quite yet. So I definitely encourage everybody to review the annex on that, because it's a fantastic set of new products that India can more easily avail.
And if I could just underscore, I mean, for those who don't follow STA1 authorization.
People that come to CSIS should know STA1. Come on.
It places India in the inner circle of our closest allies, NATO allies and partners, and it reflects just the intimacy of the strategic partnership.
Yeah. David, a new tri-services exercise. I wonder if you can shed any more light on, is that going to be an annual? Is there location, geography that we can expect from that? Any more detail you can shed in terms of what the early conversations are and what that would look like?
I think, as I mentioned, it'll allow us to kind of look at expanding some of the prior cooperation we will have in the maritime space, maritime security, maritime domain types of activities. I think what we have to do is let the planners from both sides to be get together, sit down, and actually develop it. So I think it's a significant accomplishment that we have the agreement to do it. So now we've got to let the military professionals kind of work out exactly how they want to construct it and execute it next year.
Well, there's a call for think tanks to start throwing ideas out there. So that's officially the go button for the rest of us. But with David, also on the enabling agreement. So one more, and what I had seen so far from signing COMCASA is in India, the blowback from doing that is even greatly reduced from what I've seen so far since when we signed the logistics agreement. Is the BECA, the Bilateral Exchange Cooperative Agreement, on the horizon? Have conversations begun yet? Any insight you can share on getting the next of the three big foundation agreements that we've all been kind of looking at for some time now?
As I mentioned, I think it's a pretty significant accomplishment to conclude the COMCASA agreement, and we do look at being able to move out. We've had some initial discussions on the industrial security agreement, and then we also have a BECA agreement, which I have to figure out exactly what that acronym stands for. It's like some, it's basically allows the sharing of imagery type of information. So those are enabling agreements that we want to work out with our Indian counterparts, and we've started those discussions, and the pace or the extent of those are kind of different, and we'll kind of continue working on it, and obviously we want to be able to conclude the enabling agreements as soon as possible, and a lot of that's going to depend on how far we can get in partnership with our Indian counterparts.
Looking at groupings, obviously the reconstitution of the Quad, and Alice, you mentioned in your remarks briefly about the Quad. There's press reports out there about whether or not they're looking to upgrade, and is everybody agreeing on doing that to an even more senior level? Others that a Quad meeting is expected in the next couple of months. Can you provide any more insight and update on the Quad and what we might expect? Should there be another meeting of the Quad happening at least before India's election, or are things really not yet to the planning stage on when the group might get back together?
We're working and discussing planning of the next Quad session. I think 2 meetings a year is probably a good tempo, with other working group meetings at lower level, expert level. I think we want to build up the substance ahead. I mean, the architecture will benefit from substance, and so part of the process is like, what are we doing in the trilateral format? How are we working with the Japanese to create principles, whether it's for infrastructure development, and to build up a track record of some success there, and then what do we transfer into or add to the Quad discussion, whether it's maritime domain awareness, given all of our countries' experience in this area and need to develop it further with our partners. And so I think at this stage we're looking to create evidence of what it means for for democracies to work together, and what can we put on the table that provides alternatives to other countries in the region who are looking for partners to pursue development and infrastructure development with, who are looking for partners to increase their capabilities on domain awareness and disaster assistance response. And so step by step.
Yeah.
But we're confident that we think all of these structures are valuable, they're overlapping, and they don't detract, obviously, from ASEAN's critical, essential role.
Yeah. Oh, good. That makes a lot of sense. On the trade issue, I think, from somebody who gets to spend quite a bit of time in both defense and trade issues, you do see, I think, at least at the first half of the year, a real souring on both sides. India increasing customs duties, the United States, GSP, and the Treasury notification, and then the disputes that were within the confines of the WTO, which I think everybody's a bit more comfortable with. It feels like at least having the silos where progress on the security side, not having the negativity on the trade side sort of bleeding over has been pretty good. Is that something we're able to maintain, the dual track approach? There was a statement, a reference in the joint statement that the trade issues were made there, but is it something that you'd expect breakthroughs from a 2+2, or is that something that, we've got the trade policy forum, we have the commercial dialogue, that really the real action and activity takes place in those forums? How much do you pull economic into the 2+2? How much should we expect as we get these huge issues that feel like in a moment might be able to derail things?
Well, I don't think you can silo off these issues, or put them in separate stovepipes, never to meet. I mean, I think the quality of our trade and investment relationship is going to be an extraordinary backdrop to what we try to achieve in the strategic, and security space. And I think that's how it wove into the conversations. I mean, there is the active work, diplomacy, negotiations, are being undertaken by USTR. The Trade Policy Forum is going to be the critical venue for that, and the preparations for the Trade Policy Forum. But you can't have, I don't believe, Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State walk into a room oblivious to what is the President's overarching emphasis on free and reciprocal trade. And so that very much, I think is a thematic that both of our bosses were ready to underscore. And again, I believe that our Indian partners fully appreciate this. If you look at Prime Minister Modi's speech in Davos, I mean, we embrace that, those concepts of globalization and reduced tariff barriers and increased trade. It's how do we get there? And recognizing that India is still a country that's elevating hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So I mean, there are sensitivities on both sides. I deal every day almost with members of the American business community who have their concerns. America is a country where the average tariff rate is, I think, about 3.4%, the lowest in the G20. India is the highest in the G20 at over 13%. And so that's what we're navigating.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure some of you probably heard me sort of, when I think about econ and defense, they're almost at sort of cross purposes, meaning on defense, we have good ideological link-ups with where India's at, now just trying to move on the practical. And on the econ, the practical is pretty good. A lot of investment going both ways, trade is growing, but ideological, we both are in somewhat different places and need to bridge that gap. So it's a little bit of a divergence. But one last question for both of you from my side before we open it up to the audience. We've talked a bit on Quad and Iran and Russia and things, but I think one element that had been burned into previous statements time and again was taking this to a global partnership, sometimes referencing cooperation across Southeast Asia and infrastructure development, sometimes looking at up through Central Asia, Africa, agriculture and infrastructure, a bit less of that. And I also think that, from our perception, we never really saw as much activity in some of those other geographies as we would have hoped for at the end of the day. Are there regions and areas that maybe, when you think about the global partnership that came up during the discussions, maybe didn't make their way into the joint statement, but the ways and the areas that you think we can take it beyond simply bilateral? And in particular, with South Asia, you've got a recent election in Pakistan. You've got an upcoming election in Bangladesh. Elections, in Sri Lanka feel like they aren't terribly far away either. So, even in South Asia itself. So how would you each sort of characterize expanding this as a global partnership, the geographies and issues that we'd consider?
I think just from I'd mentioned this Malabar exercise. I think the first thing from the defense side is that we do see the opportunity for cooperation with India, not only in the Indian Ocean region, but certainly beyond. I think one of the core elements of the U.S.-India defense relationship is how we're looking to use our defense relationship to build partnerships across the Indo-Pacific region. And the Malabar exercise is a primary example of that, where it's the United States and India and other partners, Japan, able to work together, in this military exercise, whether it's in the Indian Ocean or in the Western Pacific, showing that it's not limited to just the areas around India. That this is how we can work together, demonstrate interoperability, communication, our ability to work in partnership to address common tasks. And I think that's one example. I think Alice also talked about cooperation to realize stability and reconstruction in Afghanistan. So these are areas that are of critical national interest to both of our countries, and we're demonstrating that we're able to operate and cooperate in the service of those interests beyond just the U.S.-India relationship. And with respect to the defense relationship as well, I would add that there are some practical things beyond the broad kind of strategic alignment. I failed to note at the top that in terms of the defense trade, we have been able to go from zero to about $15 billion between 2008 and 2015, which I think is a pretty significant uptick to show that there is, in addition to the convergence at the strategic level, there's a lot of practical interaction that's going on between our two sides, building a foundation for greater cooperation.
I think I would end up repeating some of what David said. I mean, if you look at, again, Central Asia and Afghanistan and the unmet aspirations of the various regional projects, whether it's TAPI or CASA 1000, of really opening up a region that has among the lowest rates of intra-regional trade and connectivity. And there, I think India has a very important role to play. We're eyes wide open when it comes to a political settlement in Afghanistan. It's going to require the support of the neighbors, whether it's India, Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia. Both India is a member of the SCO, which is an organization that's very active, increasingly active in the Central Asia space, bringing together Russia and China. And so I think having that communion of values, India can play and does play, I think, a very forward-leaning role in trying to ensure that those values are also embraced in projects in that fora as well. So the partnership with India can manifest itself globally, regionally and globally, and that's why there's so much, I think, optimism and commitment to moving forward as quickly as possible.
Yeah, the regional trade integration, I remember that was one of my first interactions with Amitabh Kant, who at the time he was DIPP secretary, and he was out here for one of his Make in India things, and somebody had asked about the low level of trade integration in South Asia, and Amitabh, who is not afraid of a microphone or being on the record for anything he said, I'd gladly trade you Canada for Pakistan if you'll take it. We'll open it up to the audience now. If folks have questions, we got about a half hour to run through some questions, and we've got a couple of microphones coming around. I see Ray Vickery, so if you can quickly let us know who you are, where you're from, and hopefully make it a pretty punchy question. But Ray, you can speak as long as you want. You're the godfather, so.
Thank you. I'm Ray Vickery. I'm a senior associate non-resident here at CSIS. It seems to me that the tiger in the room, not the elephant in the room, but the tiger in the room at 2+2 is China. And one aspect of the China situation is the One Belt, One Road, and the tremendous amount of infrastructure, maritime infrastructure that China is involved in. Now recently, of course, both Pakistan and Malaysia seem to have backed off or have qualms about that. And you mentioned the port in Chabahar, and my question is, what does the United States government view as its strategic response to One Belt, One Road, Or is it just to let it die of its own weight? And how do you envisage our working with India on this issue?
I think we welcome infrastructure investment in the Indo-Pacific region, which requires, I think some experts say, $27 trillion of infrastructure investment over the next 2 decades. And obviously that's not going to come from any one country. It's any combination of countries. I think it's going to come from the private sector. And so what we seek to do under the Indo-Pacific Initiative or Indo-Pacific Strategy is to provide alternatives to countries so that we can offer the kinds of investments through our private sector or the kinds of development assistance that meets the highest international standards, that is not predatory, that's sustainable, that meets labor and environmental standards. And we don't do this out of a sense of competition with China or seeking to match China dollar for dollar. We would welcome Chinese investment that also met those standards, again, because the region is thirsty for development and for infrastructure. I think what we're seeing from several countries in the region, whether it's Sri Lanka or Malaysia, is that there are growing concerns over standards, that it's not enough just to build projects if the projects aren't economically effective, if they don't return profit, and if they're not sustainable for a government that's then forced to basically cede sovereignty over key infrastructure nodes, which is in nobody's interest. So how we come together as democracies is in espousing principles that I think are very attractive to our Indo-Pacific community. Countries want alternatives, they want options, and they want to know that the investments that are coming their way are actually going to enrich their country and lift boats. I think our private sector has an extraordinary record. We do about $1.4 trillion in bilateral trade in the Indo-Pacific, and we have about $850 billion in foreign direct investment. We're the largest player in the Indo-Pacific, and we have the best mechanism for delivering projects that make sense and that deliver. Of course, we also have other development tools that we're drawing on. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is a big one, which allows us to do $500 million projects in Nepal, which the government has added an additional $130 million to provide energy transmission lines and roadways that are ultimately going to let Nepal export energy to India. We're in negotiations for an MCC compact in Sri Lanka. We just signed one in Mongolia. And under the BUILD Act, which is before Congress, we will be able to double our development assistance to about $60 billion and have greater flexibility in how we use these development tools. One area where we have been successful is creating MOUs with Japan, so OPIC can work with its Japanese counterpart. And so we just need to become more flexible, more innovative, about how do we tap resources and reinforce each other's quite significant efforts. I mean, Japan is very active in the Indo-Pacific. Australia is very active. How do we bring greater coherence, perhaps, or greater strategic thought to moving forward?
Good. So third row back right there. We got a microphone coming to you. Again, name, organization, and punchy question, please.
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. Rick, you mentioned some statements recently regarding trade agreement between the U.S. and India. The President has mentioned that a little bit. He's also mentioned something regarding Japan. I wonder if I could ask maybe Alice to expand to some extent about what that may mean. It's interesting you noted that we have a situation where we have between the two defense departments a lot of cooperation, yet we have these fights on small but very important trade irritants. There's an imbalance there. Will the Trade Policy Forum operate differently at the end of next month than it might have otherwise in light of the statements that we've heard from the President recently?
Well, I'm a little bit outside my lane, but speaking to my pearls. There's a very active dialogue with India on fair and reciprocal trade. I mean, this has been, you heard the president express his dissatisfaction with tariffs on Harley-Davidson, for instance, a few months back. But whether it's medical stents or dairy products or chickens that finally have landed in India thanks to an agreement that was reached there, these issues matter to American private sector and business who are very attracted to the Indian market. At the same time, we're undergoing a full review of our general system of preferences, the GSP benefits. India is a recipient of about $5 billion in GSP. And so let's use this process to see how we can move past what have been some of the traditional irritants. So a very serious and conversation is underway. And we do have the TSP at the end of October. It's a good date to aim for as we try to put additional successes on the board.
Well, I think what Dana might be referring specifically to also is the White House today, President Trump himself said that a country, he didn't say which, had reached out about a trade deal, and Indian press, I think, are reporting that it was potentially India. So there was something very specific today. I don't know that the U.S. has stated that it was India, but there's a little bit of inference being made right now. But trade agreement, too, could mean so many different things, a deal on the problematic issues or whatever. There was something a little more specific that kind of broke today. Right here, second row.
Hi, Ashley Roki with Shepherd Media. On the S-400, some questions. As you're having these talks with India and Turkey, there's not really a compatible or something comparable in the US that would meet the need of the S-400, not quite Patriot, not quite that. So how do you sort of structure this? And then one of the ideas being floated that the State Department has acknowledged is helping countries pay for US systems in lieu of the S-400. So what system would you be pushing?
Well, as I had mentioned before, we're having conversations, and I don't want to get into specifics of what the nature of those conversations will entail, but this is part and parcel of the interactions that we have with our partners. I don't have Turkey in my portfolio, so I can't speak to that. But this is an area where we've got work to do.
Second row here. All right, next we'll come to the back.
Yes, ma'am. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. You mentioned about Indian role in Afghanistan and Lashkar-e-Taiba in the same breath. I just wondered that if China and Pakistan are on the same page, because without their participation, it's almost impossible to have peace in that part of the world. And if there is no peace, India cannot become a shining city on the hill. And regarding that, do you expect maturity in the relationship of with these two countries with the U.S.? I'm talking about Indian Prime Minister got upset just because somebody imitated his accent. The Pakistani guy, Imran Khan, he expects America to treat him as a partner in peace. I don't know if he is just using these catchy phrases without knowing that Pakistan literally depends on American handout, or at least American blessing. This country cannot survive itself. Nawaz Sharif and Mr. 10% was realistic that country cannot survive, so they should take out whatever they could, steal and take. But this
is China and Pakistan, and whether we have a
realization of Imran Khan's expectation that he wants respect from America. He wants America to become a partner in peace without mentioning that Pakistan has become literally a beggar country. Thanks.
So China-Pakistan engagement in Afghanistan, are we on the same page? Imran Khan, can he be a partner?
Yeah. I agree with you that the countries of the region all have a critical role to play in ensuring the stabilization and success of Afghanistan. And whether that's Pakistan or China or Central Asia, Russia, Iran, this is going to be, it's critical that Afghanistan have the support of its neighbors. And we have stressed, I think, in our conversations with the Pakistani leadership, certainly over the last year or so that I've been working in the Bureau, that Pakistan has a critical role to play in helping to bring peace to Afghanistan. And our desire is to see Pakistan use all of the resources and the influence that it has to convince the Taliban that now is the time, to walk through what is a very open door by the government of Afghanistan, by the international community, by the United States, to negotiate a dignified settlement at a table. I think the secretary who just visited Islamabad before he traveled onward to Delhi had good constructive consultations with the leadership. It was his first opportunity to meet with Prime Minister Imran Khan. And it was an opportunity for the secretary to sort of lay out aspirations for the relationship. I think I disagree with your characterization that Pakistan is somehow a puppet or dependent on the United States. I don't see that at all. But I do see a sovereign country that has a choice to make. And I would hope that the choice is what was attributed to Chief of Army Staff General Bajwa, who said, as long as there are extremist, non-state forces operating in Pakistan, Pakistan can't be a normal state. And so I think it's tackling that core issue that's going to be so critical, both to the quality of our bilateral relationship, but also to the prospects for better relations between India and Pakistan.
Good one near the back there, second row from the back.
Thank you. My name's Anshu. I'm a reporter with Inside U.S. Trade. I just want to add a question on the trade front. Ambassador Wells, you mentioned that it was difficult to kind of silo the trade and economic issues from the defense and diplomatic issues, and that Secretary Mattis and Pompeo couldn't be oblivious to the president's trade goals. I'm wondering if that kind of cuts the other way, in that does the security and diplomatic cooperation kind of add pressure on the U.S. to resolve the trade issues? Are Ambassador Lighthizer and Secretary Ross sort of as cognizant of the defense and security, security and diplomatic cooperation, and is that kind of affecting how they're approaching GSP or Section 232 tariffs? Thanks.
I just think that both the U.S. and Indian leadership recognizes that what we're trying to create is this, vital, healthy, deep partnership, between global powers. And to do that, you have to have all of the foundation, strong. And so the goal is not to have just a defense relationship with India. The goal is to have a relationship that captures the people-to-people ties, that captures the innovation potential between our societies, that captures, what is special about our societies, the values that we uphold, the constitutions that enshrine rights, for minorities and religions. And so how do we manifest that relationship comprehensively? So I think that drives all of us as we work on this relationship.
See one right there. Got one coming behind you on the other side.
Thank you. My name is Anil Sigdel. I'm from Nepal Matters for America in Washington. My question is to Madam Wells. Since we were there very recently, what does this 2+2 really mean for India's neighbors, especially countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, given the fact that the relationship with India is fairly complicated? And there's wide speculation right now in Nepal and these countries that India might leverage this deepening relationship with the US to twist arms of its neighbors, because it seems like they value their friendship with China more than their friendship with India. So I want to hear from you about what will be like US position vis-a-vis this kind of challenging situation right now. Thank you.
When I was in Nepal for consultations a couple of weeks ago, I always underscored that our relationship with Nepal stands on its own. We have healthy and vibrant and growing relationships with Nepal, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka. You heard the Secretary of State announce the Bay of Bengal initiative, which is going to give us, in the instance of Nepal, $17 million more to help in the humanitarian disaster response area. We're very committed to Nepal through the Millennium Challenge Corporation, through our 70-year commitment of Peace Corps volunteers, to really an intense relationship between our societies. I was shocked to learn that Nepal is among, I think, the top 12 countries sending students to the United States. So, I have no concerns about the strength of our bilateral relationship. I think the partnership of the U.S. and India as part of the Indo-Pacific is very important for Nepal and for the other countries of South Asia. It is an important new dynamic, and it's something that we should harness in a productive way, but certainly not in a way that would ever undercut the sovereignty or the standalone relationships that all of our countries enjoy with one another.
Yeah. We got time for a couple of others. Alan, I see your hand over there.
Thank you. I'm Alan Kronstadt, Congressional Research Service. Ambassador Wells, this question is for you. I'd say 20 years ago, among top-tier issues in U.S.-India relationship was nuclear proliferation, human rights, and Kashmir. So it's understandable that the development of a partnership would crowd out those, but it is noticeable that those don't seem to get mentioned at all today. I wanted to ask specifically about human rights. As you know, your own department puts out reports that discuss extensive human rights violations. Some of them seem to be perpetrated by the state in India. And one item that's attracted a lot of attention on the Hill recently is religious freedom issues under this BJP-led government. So I'm aware that some members of Congress wrote a letter to Mr. Pompeo in the lead up to the 2+2, asking him to bring up some of these issues with his interlocutors and counterparts. Can you say if that took place during the 2+2, and how might you respond to folks who are concerned that human rights issues have fallen away when it comes to U.S.-India engagement?
No, what I can say is that with all countries, including with India, we have conversations about human rights, and I think, and obviously, the Human Rights Report is the manifestation of a lot of conversations and research that our embassy has done. When it comes to a country like India, which is a vibrant democracy, which has constitutionally enshrined rights for minorities, for freedom of religion, we respect democracies. We respect democracies because we believe democracies are self-correcting, because that there are institutions at play. And so I think the spirit of the dialogue takes place within that framework of respect for one another and for the fact that we stand for and have fought for and have enshrined in institutions these principles, and recognizing that we too are not immune from criticism.
Any last before we, I see one back in the corner there.
Thank you for doing this. I'm Krishnadev Kalamur with The Atlantic. How do you square the idea of putting pressure on Iran with, while considering the development of Chabahar port?
We're reviewing in the context in particular of Afghanistan and in the spirit that I think David mentioned, that the idea of our sanctions are not to punish partners or to imperil partners, but to bring a price tag for Iran's malign behavior. And so as we review the issue of Chabahar, it'll be in the context of what it provides for the stabilization of Afghanistan or for the kind of regional connectivity that serves other interests as well. But it's an ongoing process of review.
Great. Well, I hope you all join me in thanking Alice and David for making time out of their busy schedules. Thank you both.